Well, happy Independence Day, everybody. I have to tell you, I was originally thinking that I would entitle this episode Happy Dependence Day and have a tattered picture of an American flag there and decaying brick and so on. And I thought, what kind of communist does something like that, for God's sake? So it's Independence Day, and I thought that would be an interesting topic for us to talk about the entire idea of independence. Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Ott, and this is your Independence Day Right Angle, brought to you by the paying members at BillWhittle.com. So, gentlemen, we've had all kinds of different labels for the two sides of the camp throughout the ages. I think it's extremely accurate to say that modern conservatives are traditional liberals. We're trying to conserve traditional liberalism. So these labels, left and right and liberal, conservative, and all the rest of it, changes all the time, Republicans and Democrats and so on and so forth. But in all the time I've spent thinking about this, I was able to come up with a definition that seemed to hold throughout history and all across the world, and that is individualists versus collectivists, really. That's really where you can put most of these two schools of thought. Scotty, let's start with you. The idea of independence is anathema to people who want to control a large state. The essence of a large state is the submersion of the individual into the state, and when you take it to its most disgusting extremes, it almost becomes a religious belief. Yes, I may die, but the state lives on, and that's the main thing. What do you think that does to the human capital of any nation or any group of people to remove their ability to function on their own and to make them dependent, not even on their neighbors, so much as to make them absolutely dependent for their livelihood, their medicine, their food, their clothing, their health? What does it do to people to have them utterly dependent on some kind of outside force?
I think like most debates, this one founders on definition of terms. And I think when people make the argument that, you didn't build that, individual effort wasn't important, you had the help of all kinds of other people. Any individualist worth his salt understands that he got where he is today through the cooperation of others. In fact, the very foundation of capitalism is that reliance on a division of labor in producing things, as Adam Smith used the analogy of, basically you don't make your own fish hook, So, But that doesn't mean that if you catch a great big old bass that you've got to go, no, it was the guy who made the fish hook and the guy who made the fiberglass for the boat and the guy from Evinrude and, So I think because there are two different levels on which this debate happens, the person who's the collectivist that I'll call the statist, the person who really is in favor of state collectivism, is the one who pulls out that argument and basically says, you couldn't have gotten where you are today, Bill Whittle, if it weren't for the cooperation of at least two other guys and maybe more.
So who'd you have in mind?
I don't know. Actually, you would have done fine without me. But that's not what we're arguing. That's not what an individualist is saying. Is that I pulled my boots up by my own bootstraps and I don't need help from nobody for nothing. But what we are saying is that I don't want the mob to control my behavior. I don't want the mob to have veto power over my honest, non-harmful activities. Things that will not injure anybody else. And so I think more often than not, when we get into discussion with somebody who sees things differently from us politically, we need to back up and say, let's talk about what we're actually talking about. Like, what are you really saying here? Because I, as an individualist, am not saying that I don't need help to do things from anybody. Mm-hmm. Are you, as a collectivist, saying that the individual can't do anything? Probably not. So what we're really arguing about is the form of government and the division of labor in it as to how it comes down and determines what we can and cannot do in our lives. And what I don't want is a collectivist government that mandates my activities based on the will of the majority, who at one time or another could be swept along by a charismatic personality who decides that what you're doing is no good. That said, I think, I would most likely, as in my studies of the writing of the Constitution, I most likely would have voted against ratification. I mean, it's at that time. Now I'm this huge, like a big fan of the Constitution and everything. But if you read the arguments of the opponents, the so-called anti-federalists, who were really the true federalists, their argument was, hey, wait a minute, we really got to watch out for this consolidated, centralized, remote control government. I probably would have been with them.
Steve, I look at what's happened to American society. I look at the ever-increasing numbers of people who are on welfare, of food stamps, and so on. I think it's something like half of all Americans now are on some form of government assistance. But if you take that bell curve to the edge and you look at it at its most extreme, what the collectivists have done to America's inner cities is inexplicable. I have given it a great deal of thought. It is inexplicable unless you accept the premise that it is in the interest of some people to make the people who do the voting utterly dependent on their largesse. That's the only explanation that makes sense for any of this. This is why students are being dumbed down. This is why we talk about how does calculus feel instead of having answers on calculus. All of this, I think, is designed, whether consciously or not, to create a citizenry that is no longer a citizenry. It's the masses. It's the people that mine the coal and shovel the manure so that we can tell them what to do. I can't think of another reason for how you can explain all of this stuff. What is it about these people that are so determined to stamp out individuality and independence? The whole idea of independence is anathema to them.
Wow, there's so much there. And what is it? Is it power? Is it the desire for power, to lord it over other people? Is it to feather your own nest with all the largesse that you skim off the top on its way back to your voters? Is it the desire to be in the history books as the big man who ran the big city for 30 years? I think all of these things come into play, and it's a real shame. It's un-American. It's anti-American to want other people to live under you, and it's un-American to desire to live for the sake of some big man, of some big boss, and it's a shame. Independence is the ability to tell somebody to go to hell and not suffer for it outside of that little sphere. You can tell your boss to go to hell, and the worst he can do in this country is to fire you. If you live in a big city, or if you live in the Soviet Union and you're depending on some sort of government housing and you tell your boss to go to hell, well, he makes a call to the party commissar and suddenly you've lost your apartment. And if you were lucky enough, and if you were lucky enough to have a car, suddenly you don't have the permits to drive that anymore, or maybe now you're digging a canal in the frozen tundra up until your very death. So independence is the ability to say, go to hell to whoever you like, and not suffer anything more than whatever that person might do or say in response to you. But the bigger the state is, the more tendrils it shoots out into people's private lives, then the fewer people you can say that to and get away with it, because they can really ruin your lives. We see this happen in social media now, and it is, as Scott said, a mob mentality to snuff out any sort of disagreement. Now, let me finish with just a little short story. Summer of 1988, presidential election year, Bush versus Dukakis, and I was a 19-year-old intern at KMOX Radio back in St. Louis, big old 50,000-watt Clear Channel AM news station, and I was having a conversation with a reporter there, probably in his late 20s at the time, and as I said, I was a 19-year-old kid, and I was just always looking for a political argument, right? Brash, young libertarian, going to show these people what's up. And I don't remember what we were talking about. I'm sure it was something election related. And he made a very stunning admission, I thought. It was certainly a very clear admission. He said, well, I guess in the end, you think people should be unfettered, but I think they need to be chained. And I looked at him. I was shocked that a Democrat, that a lefty would be this open about his intentions. And I asked him, well, where do you see yourself, wearing the chain or holding it? And he was really taken aback by that. He looked thoughtful and kind of walked off. And a few years later, the next time I heard him on the air, he was still just a big old lefty. So I guess he didn't learn anything from that. But Bill, I think at root, this desire for power comes from a hatred of human beings, and that hatred has to start right in your own heart for your very own self. It's a shame.
Beautifully said, both of you. This is why the whole idea of independence interests me. I'm a big fan of independence. I like my own independence, and other people's independence doesn't bother me. This is the central point, okay? I like my independence, but I don't care what other people do so long as it doesn't adversely affect me. I don't care. Which leads me to the inverse of what that is, and this is what Steve and Scott both talked about. What is wrong with somebody who has determined that the only way they can feel good about themselves is to have other people do what they tell them to do? Because that's really what it comes down to. Collectivists hate the idea of independence because independence in computer talk is multiple parallel processing. Lots and lots and lots of individual processes that are doing their own thing, communicating with their neighbors and so on, and it is uncontrollable. It's like the internet. That's why they hate the internet so much, and freedom and all the rest of this stuff. What they want is they want the entire data structure to go through one processor that they can control, and it comes down to control. So if you look at Hugo Chavez, his daughter is worth $4.5 billion while the entire country starves to death. Fidel Castro basically bankrupted his nation for half a century. He retired with $900 million personally in the bank. You get a guy like Lenin, who was a failed lawyer, or a guy like Hitler, who was a failed actor. And both of these people, all of these people, are motivated by an overwhelming desire to control other people because they want the results of hard work, intelligence, and perseverance, but they don't want to do the work necessary. They want to take it from other people, which leads me to believe that one of two things is true. Either the impulse to tell other people what to do is a mental illness, which I am quite convinced is the case, but I'm willing to consider one other thing. It is possible, given the history of humanity and the history of how we govern ourselves, it's not only possible, it's actually kind of likely that we're the ones with a mental illness, that there's something different and wrong about us, that the idea that people could get together and realize that they could run their own lives just fine, thank you, is so contrary to the entire history of the species, history of mammals, the history of animals. It's a pretty big net you're throwing there. So to the degree that we're a nation of genetic freaks who, hit by cosmic rays, decided that we didn't have to depend on somebody else, that we could run our own lives successfully, as it turned out, and have fun doing it as well. To the degree that we're all here together in one spot, that we're self-selected as risk takers and people who are not willing to stand in line and back away from the king after we handed him all of our scrawny potatoes, if you're one of those people that's got that in your bloodstream, I don't have to explain it to you, but it does make you actually question what it is about telling others what to do that gives people such an incredible thrill. And when you look at it not so much from a historical point of view, but from a moral point of view, you realize that makes this just the greatest place in the history of the world, and the people live in it just the very best people that ever were. And that's something to be rather proud about. I'm certainly proud about it. I think we're the best people in the entire galaxy. For everybody here at Right Angle, I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Ott. Happy Independence Day, everybody, and for God's sakes, fight the desire to turn this into Dependence Day, tooth and nail with everything you've got on every level, large and small.